Chapter 11, Reconnaissance. Although the story of a campaign is made up of many details which cannot be omitted, since they are essential to the truth as well as the interest of the account, it is of paramount importance that the reader should preserve throughout a general idea. For otherwise the marches, forays, and reconnaissance will seem disconnected and purposeless affairs, and the battle simply a greater operation undertaken in the same haphazard fashion. To appreciate the tale, it is less necessary to contemplate the wild scenes and stirring incidents, than thoroughly to understand the logical sequence of incidents, which all tend to and ultimately culminate in a decisive trial of strength. The hazards which were courted by the daring occupation of Berber have been discussed in the last chapter. From October to December the situation was threatening. In December it suddenly became critical. Had the Emir Mahmud advanced with the dervishes at Metemma even as late as the middle of January, he might possibly have recaptured Berber. If the great Omdurman army had taken the field, the possibility would have become a certainty. The young Kordofan general saw his opportunity, and begged to be allowed to seize it. But it was not until the Khalifa had sent his own army back into the city that, being very badly informed of the numbers and disposition of the Egyptian force, he allowed the Metemma dervishes to move. Mahmud received permission to advance at the end of January. He eagerly obeyed the longed-for order. But the whole situation was now changed. The Egyptian army was concentrated, the British brigade had arrived, the railway had reached Genineti, the miserable hamlet of Dakila, at the confluence, had grown from a small depot to a fort, and from a fort to an entrenched camp, against which neither dervish science nor strength could by any possibility prevail. Perhaps Mahmud did not realize the amazing power of movement that the railway had given his foes, perhaps he still believed, with the Khalifa, that Berber was held only by 2,000 Egyptians. Or else, and this is the most probable, he was reckless of danger and strong in his own conceit. At any rate, during the second week in February, he began to transport himself across the Nile, with the plain design of an advance north. With all the procrastination of an Arab, he crawled leisurely forward towards the confluence of the rivers. At El Aliab some idea of the strength of the Atbara entrenchment seems to have dawned upon him. He paused undecided. A council was held. Mahmud was for a continued advance, and for making a direct attack on the enemy's position. Osman Digna urged a more prudent course. Many years of hard fighting against disciplined troops had taught the wily Hadendoa Slava the power of modern rifles, and much sound tactics besides. He pressed his case with jealous enthusiasm upon the commander he detested and despised. An insurmountable obstacle confronted them. Yet what could not be overcome might be avoided. The hardy dervishes could endure privations, which would destroy the soldiers of civilization. Barren and inhospitable as was the desert, they might move round the army at the Atbara fort, and so capture Berber after all. Once they were behind the Egyptians, these accursed ones were lost. The railway, that mysterious source of strength, could be cut. The host that drew its life along it must fight, at a fearful disadvantage, or perish miserably. Besides, he reminded Mahmud, not without reason, that they could count on help in Berber itself. The agreement of the emirs, called to the council, decided the dervish leader. His confidence in himself was weakened, his hatred of Osman Digna increased. Nevertheless, following the older man's advice, he left Aliab on the 18th of March, and struck northeast into the desert towards the village and ford of Hudi on the Atbara River. Thence by a long desert march, he might reach the Nile and Berber. But while his information of the Sirdar's force and movements was uncertain, the British general was better served. What Mahmud failed to derive from spies and friendlies, his adversary obtained by gunboats and cavalry. As soon, therefore, as Sir H. Kitchener learned that the dervishes had left the Nile, and were making a detour around his left flank, he marched up the Atbara River to Hudi. This offered Mahmud the alternative of attacking him in a strong position, or of making a still longer detour. Having determined upon caution, he chose the latter, and deflecting his march still more to the east, reached the Atbara at Nikala. But from this point the distance to Berber was far too great for him to cover. He could not carry enough water in his skins. The wells were few, and held against him. Further advance was impossible. So he waited and entrenched himself, sorely troubled, but uncertain what to do. Supplies were running short. His magazines at Shundi had been destroyed as soon as he had left the Nile. The dervishes might exist, but they did not thrive on the nuts of the dom palms. Soldiers began to desert. Osman Digna, although his advice had been followed, was at open enmity. His army dwindled. And all this time his terrible antagonist watched him as a tiger gloats on a helpless and certain prey, silent, merciless, inexorable. Then the end came suddenly. As soon as the process of attrition was sufficiently far advanced to demoralize the dervish host, without completely dissolving them, the Sirdar and his army moved. The victim, as if petrified, was powerless to fly. The tiger crept forward 2 measured strides, from Ras el Hudi to Al-Badar, from Al-Badar to Dabia, crouched for a moment, and then bounded with irresistible fury upon its prey, and tore it to pieces. Such is a brief strategic account of the Atbara campaign, but the tale must be told in full. On the 23rd of January the Khalifa, having learned of the arrival of British troops near Abu Hamd, and baffled by the disputes about the command of his army, ordered Kareri camp to be broken up, and permitted his forces to return within the city, which he continued to fortify. A few days later, he authorized Mahmud to advance against Berber. What he had not dared with 60,000 men he now attempted with 20,000. The course of action, which had for 3 months offered a good hope of success, he resolved to pursue only when it led to ruin. He forbade the advance while it was advisable. When it was already become mad and fatal he commanded it. And this was a man whose reputation for intelligence and military skill had been bloodily demonstrated. The gunboats ceaselessly patrolled the river, and exchanged shots with the dervish forts. Throughout January nothing of note had happened. The reports of spies showed the Khalifa to be at Kareri, or in Omdurman. Ahmed Fedil held the Shabluka Gorge, Osman Digna was at Shundi, and his presence was proved by the construction of 2 new forts on that side of the river. But beyond this the dervishes had remained passive. On the 12th of February, however, it was noticed that their small outpost at Kuli had been withdrawn. This event seemed to point to a renewal of activity. It was felt that some important movement impended. But it was not until the 15th that its nature was apparent, and the gunboats were able to report definitely that Mahmud was crossing to the east bank of the Nile. On the same day the enemy were reported moving northwards to Aliab, and it became evident that Mahmud had begun his advance. On the same day the enemy were reported moving northwards to Aliab, and it became evident that Mahmud had begun his advance. He started from Shundi with a force which has been estimated at 19,000 souls, but which included many women and children, and may have actually numbered 12,000 fighting men, each and all supplied with a month's rations and about 90 rounds of ammunition. The Sirdar immediately ordered the Anglo-Egyptian army, with the exception of the cavalry and Lewis's Egyptian brigade, which, with 3 squadrons, held the fort at the confluence, to concentrate at Kunua. Broadwood, with the remaining 5 squadrons, marched thither on the 16th, and the whole cavalry force, with the Camel Corps in support, on the 3 subsequent days reconnoitred 20 miles up the Nile and the Atbara. Meanwhile the concentration was proceeding apace. The 2 Sudanese brigades, formed into a division under command of Major General Hunter, with the artillery, reached Kunua on the night of the 15th. The British brigade, the Lincolns, the Warwicks, and the Camerons, marched thither from Debeka. The Seaforth Highlanders, who on the 13th were still at Wadi Halfa, was swiftly railed across the desert to Genineti. Thence the 1st half battalion were brought to Kunua in steamers. The second wing, since the need was urgent and the steamers few, were jolted across the desert from railhead on camels, an experience for which neither their training nor their clothes had prepared them. By the 16th the whole force was concentrated at Kunua, and on the following day they were reviewed by the Sirdar. The first 3 days at Kunua were days of eager expectation. Rumor was king. The dervish army had crossed the Atbara at Hudi, and was within 10 miles of the camp. Mahmud was already making a flank march through the desert to Berber. A battle was imminent. A collision must take place in a few hours. Officers with field glasses scanned the sandy horizon for the first signs of the enemy. But the skyline remained unbroken, except by the wheeling dust devils, and gradually the excitement abated, and the British brigade began to regret all the useful articles they had scrupulously left behind them at Debeka, when they marched in a hurry and the lightest possible order to Kunua. On the 19th of March the gunboats reported that the dervishes were leaving the Nile, and Mahmud's flanking movement became apparent. The next day the whole force at Kunua marched across the desert angle between the rivers to Hudi. The appearance of the army would have been formidable. The cavalry, the camel corps, and the horse artillery covered the front and right flank. The infantry, with the British on the right, moved in line of brigade masses. The transport followed. All was, however, shrouded in a fearful dust storm. The distance, 10 miles, was accomplished in 5 hours, and the army reached Hudi in time to construct a strong zeriba before the night. Here they were joined from Atbara fort by Lewis's brigade of Egyptians, with the exception of the 15th Battalion, which was left as garrison, and the troops at the Sirdar's disposal were thus raised to 14,000 men of all arms. This force was organized as follows. Commander-in-Chief, the Sirdar British Brigade, Major General Gataka, 1st Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment, 6 companies, Lincolnshire Regiment, Seaforth Highlanders, Cameron Highlanders Egyptian Infantry Division, Major General Hunter 1st Brigade 2nd Brigade 3rd Brigade LIEUT, COL, Maxwell LIEUT, COL, MacDonald LIEUT, COL. Lewis 8th Egyptians 2nd Egyptians 3rd. Egyptians XIth Sudanese IXTH Sudanese 4th XIIth, XTH, 7th XIVTH, XIth, Cavalry, LIEUT, COL, Broadwood 8 Squadrons 2 Maxim Guns Camel Corps. Major Tudway 6 Companies Artillery, LIEUT, COL, Long Detachment, No. 16 Company, E Division RA, with 6 5-inch BL howitzers Egyptian Horse Battery, 6 guns, numbers 1, 2, and 3 field batteries Egyptian Army, 18 guns, British Maxim Battery, 4 guns, Rocket Detachment, 2 sections. Mahmud had early intelligence of the movement of the Anglo-Egyptian army. His original intention had been to march to Hudi. But he now learned that at Hudi he would have to fight the Sirdar's main force. Not feeling strong enough to attack them, he determined to march to Nikala. The mobility of the Arabs was now as conspicuous as their dilatory nature had formerly been. The whole dervish army, horse, foot, and artillery, men, women, children, and animals, actually traversed in a single day the 40 miles of waterless desert which lie between Aliab and Nikala, at which latter place they arrived on the night of the 20th. The Sirdar's next object was to keep the enemy so far up the Atbara that they could not possibly strike at Berber or Railhead. Accordingly, at dawn on the 21st, the whole force was ordered to march to Ras el Hudi, 5 miles nearer the dervishes' supposed halting place. The detour which the Arabs would have to make to march round the troops was nearly doubled by this movement. The utter impossibility of their flank march, with a stronger enemy on the radius of the circle, was now apparent. The movement of the Anglo-Egyptian force was screened by 7 squadrons of cavalry and the horse artillery, and Colonel Broadwood was further instructed to reconnoiter along the river and endeavor to locate the enemy. The country on either bank of the Atbara is covered with dense scrub, impassable for civilized troops. From these belts, which average a quarter of a mile in depth, the dom palms rise in great numbers. All the bush is leafy, and looks very pretty and green by contrast with the somber vegetation of the Nile. Between the trees fly gay parrots and many other bright birds. The river itself above Ras El Hudi is, during March and April, only a dry bed of white sand about 400 yards broad, but dotted with deep and beautifully clear pools, in which peculiarly brilliant fish and crocodiles, deprived of their stream, are crowded together. The atmosphere is more damp than by the Nile, and produces, in the terrible heat of the summer, profuse and exhausting perspiration. The natives dislike the water of the Atbara, and declare that it does not quench the thirst like that of the great river. It has, indeed, a slightly bitter taste, which is a strong contrast with the sweet waters of the Nile. Nevertheless, the British soldiers, with characteristic contrariness, declared their preference for it. Outside the bush the ground undulated gently, but the surface was either stony and uneven or else cracked and fissured by the annual overflow. Both these conditions made it hard for cavalry, and still more for artillery, to move freely, and the difficulties were complicated by frequent holes and small khors full of long grass. Amid such scenes the squadrons moved cautiously forward. Having made the ground good for 15 miles from Hudi, Colonel Broadwood halted his force at Arbadar, an old fort, and sent one squadron under Captain Le Gallais 7 miles further. At 2 o'clock this squadron returned, having met a few of the enemy's scouts, but no formed bodies. While the force watered by turns at the river, Captain Baring's squadron was extended in a line of outposts about 1.25 miles to the southeast. But the reconnoitering squadron had been followed homeward by several hundred dervish horsemen. Creeping along through the dense bush by the bank and evading the vedettes, these suddenly fell on the picket line and drove in all the outposts. In this affair 8 troopers were killed and 7 wounded. 13 horses were also lost, as, having rid themselves of their riders on the broken ground, they galloped off after the Arab mares on which the dervishes were mostly mounted. The news of an attack on Adarama was received on this same afternoon. It appeared that the Arabs had been repulsed by the Abyssinian irregulars raised by Colonel Parsons. Glowing details were forthcoming, but I do not propose to recount the Homeric struggles of the friendlies. Little in them is worthy of remembrance, much seeks oblivion. For more than a week the Anglo-Egyptian force remained halted at Ras El Hudi, waiting for privation to demoralize Mahmud's army, or to exasperate him into making an attack. Every morning the cavalry rode out towards the enemy's camp. All day long they skirmished with or watched the Baggara horse, and at night they returned wearily to camp. Each morning the army awoke full of the hopes of battle, waited during the long hours, and finally retired to sleep in deep disgust and profound peace. And while the army halted, the camp began to assume a more homely appearance. The zareba grew stronger and thicker, the glacis wider, the field kitchens more elaborate, the pools of the Atbara more dirty. Over all the sun beat down in merciless persistence, till all white men quivered with weary suffering when in the open air, and even under the grass huts, or improvised tents, the temperature always registered 115 degrees during the hottest hours of the day. The nights were, however, cool and pleasant. But although the main part of the force found the days long and tedious, the time which the army spent at Ras El Hudi was by no means uneventful. The work of the squadrons was hard, and ceased only with the night. The continual patrolling told severely on men and horses, and the fact that the dervishes were far stronger in the mounted arm than the Sirdar's army necessitated the utmost vigilance of the cavalry commander. Employment was also found for the gunboats. When Mahmud had left the Nile he had established a sort of depot at Shundi, in which the wives of the emirs and the surplus stores had been deposited. This treasure house was protected only by a slender garrison of 700 riflemen and 25 horsemen. On ordinary military grounds, and also since the event might infuriate the Arabs, it was decided to capture this place and disperse its defenders. Accordingly, On the afternoon of the 24th, the 3rd Egyptian Battalion from Lewis's brigade marched from Ras el Hudi to Atbara Fort and relieved the 15th Egyptians, then in garrison, and a small force under Commander Keppel, consisting of the 15th Egyptians under Major Hickman, 2 field guns of Peake's battery, and 150 Jalin irregulars, was embarked on, or in boats towed by, the 3 gunboats Zafar, Nusser, and Fatih, and started the same night for Shindi. At dawn on the 27th the flotilla appeared off Shindi. The dervishes had been apprised of its approach, and prepared to offer resistance. But the force against them was overwhelming. Under cover of the gunboats the infantry and guns were landed. The artillery then came into action, but after they had discharged 2 shells, the Arabs fled, firing their rifles with little effect. Shindi was occupied by the Egyptians. The pursuit was left to the Jalin, and in it they are said to have killed 160 men, a revenge which must have been doubly sweet since it was consummated so near to the scene of the destruction of their tribe, and was also attended by scarcely any danger. Loot of all kinds fell to the victors, and the gunboats were soon laden with a miscellaneous spoil. The wives of the important emirs made their escape to Omdurman, but upwards of 650 women and children of inferior rank were taken prisoners and transported to the Atbara, where in due course they contracted new family ties with the Sudanese soldiery, and as far as can be ascertained, lived happily ever afterwards. There were no casualties among the troops, but the Jalin lost a few men in their pursuit. The force then returned to the Atbara. The 3rd of April was the last day the army spent at Ras el Hudi. The period of waiting was over. The enemy's position had been duly reconnoitred. His strength was believed to be sufficiently impaired for a successful attack to be made. The camp at Hudi was becoming very insanitary. Moreover, the situation, satisfactory though it was not one which the commander could view without anxiety. All the time that the army was operating on the Atbara, it drew its supplies from the fort at the confluence. Between this and the camp, convoys, protected only by a handful of camel corps, passed once in every 4 days. Only the idiotic apathy of the dervishes allowed the communications to remain uninterrupted. Mahmud was strong in cavalry. It will be evident to anyone who looks at the map how easily a force might have moved along the left bank to attack the convoys. Such tactics would have occurred to most savage tribes. But in their last campaigns the dervishes thought only of battles, and disregarded all smaller enterprises. Had they assailed the communications, the Sirdar might have been forced to build a chain of forts, and to guard his convoys with strong infantry escorts. The fighting force would have been weakened, the troops have been wearied, and the result must have been delayed. The dervishes had as yet attempted nothing. But there was no reason why they should not at any moment become enterprising. It was time to make an end. On the 4th of April the whole force moved to Al-Badar, and established themselves in a new camp 5 miles nearer the enemy. The tiger was tired of watching. He had taken his first stride towards his prey. Although the information as to the enemy's strength and position was accurate and complete, the Sirdar decided to order a final reconnaissance on the 5th of April. Starting at 4 o'clock, Broadwood cut off the sharp angle which the Atbara forms at Dabia, and avoiding the thick bush, soon approached the dervish camp. Not a sign of the enemy was seen during the march. The bush by the Atbara appeared deserted. The camp gave no sign of life, an ominous silence prevailed. The squadrons moved forward at a walk, keeping about 1,200 yards away from the enemy's zareba, and almost parallel to it. Presently, as they did so, a large force of cavalry became visible in front. It was difficult to estimate their strength, but they appeared to be superior in numbers to the reconnaissance. The dervish horsemen continued to retire towards the southeast, always reaching round the Egyptian left flank. And while the Egyptian force advanced, as soon as they were opposite the southern end of the zareba, another considerable body of dervish horse issued from the northern side and threatened the line of retreat. At the same time the camp began to swarm with men, and crowds of tiny figures were observed clambering onto the entrenchments and gun emplacements, eagerly watching the development of the fight. The cavalry had by this time approached to within 1,000 yards of the zareba, and the Arab artillery began to fire occasional round shot and clumsily fused shells. At 9 o'clock, the enemy's position having been again sketched and the approaches reconnoitred, Colonel Broadwood ordered the retirement to begin. The Maxims and artillery were in the center, supported by Colonel Broadwood and 3 squadrons. Captain Baring with 3 squadrons watched the left flank, now in retirement become the right. Captains Le Gallais and Perce guarded the river flank. The cavalry retired by alternate wings in measured fashion. But the enemy pressed on impetuously, and their horsemen, soon completely enveloping the desert flank of the Egyptians, began to threaten a charge. To meet this, Colonel Broadwood sent one of his squadrons from the center to join those under Captain Baring, so that at about 9:45 the reconnoitering force was formed with 4 squadrons towards the desert, 2 with the guns, and 2 towards the river. The weakness of the river flank of the troops encouraged the dervish horse lurking in the scrub to make a bold attempt to capture the guns. The movement was shrewd and daring, but the cavalry commander met it with admirable skill. The springing up of dust clouds, hardly 300 yards away, was his only warning. He immediately took command of the 2 squadrons under Perce and Le Gallais, and ordered them to right about wheel and charge. Thus headed by Broadwood himself, and with their British officers several horse lengths in front, the Egyptians broke into a gallop and encountered the Baggara line, which numbered not fewer than 400 men, but was in loose order, with firmness. They struck them obliquely and perhaps 1/3 of the way down their line, and, breaking through, routed them utterly. While this dashing operation was carried out on the river flank, the dervish cavalry, following up the retirement, also delivered an attack towards the guns. Thereupon Captain Baring with 2 squadrons galloped from the desert flank across the front of the artillery, and, riding through the advancing enemy, repulsed them with loss. The charge was good and effective, but the shock and confusion broke both squadrons, and, although successful, they came through the dervishes and back onto the river flank in some disorder. Perce and Le Gallais, who had just rallied, at once dismounted their men and opened carbine fire on the retreating dervishes. Their action not only checked the enemy, but prevented, by getting the troopers off their horses, any chance of their being involved in the disorder of the squadrons, who had just charged. Although their horsemen were thus sharply checked, the dervish infantry continued in spite of losses to advance rapidly, and for a few minutes a hot musketry fire was exchanged by the Arab riflemen and the 2 dismounted squadrons. Captain Perce was severely wounded, and several other casualties occurred. But the whole force was drawing away from the enemy, and by 11 o'clock it had passed through the gap to the northeast, and had shaken off all pursuit. The casualties in the operation were fortunately small. 1 British officer was wounded, 6 Egyptian troopers were killed and 10 wounded, and about 30 horses were lost or disabled. The details of the enemy's defenses were now known. His strength was estimated from trustworthy information. It was evident from the frequent desertions that his army was disheartened, and from his inactivity that he was scarcely hopeful of success. The moment for destroying him had arrived. At daybreak on the morning of the 6th the whole army broke camp at Arbada, and marched to the deserted village of Umdabia, where they bivouacked close by a convenient pool of the Atbara, and 7 miles nearer the dervish camp. Chapter 12, The Battle of the Atbara. April 8, 1898. In the evening of Thursday, the 7th of April, the army at Umdabia paraded for the attack on Mahmud's zareba. The camp lay in the scrub which grows by the banks of the Atbara, as by those of the Nile, and in order to profit by the open, level ground the 4 infantry brigades moved by parallel routes into the desert, and then formed facing southeast in column of brigade squares, the British brigade leading. The mounted forces, with 4 batteries of artillery, waited in camp until 2 o'clock the next morning, and did not break their march. The distance from the river bank to the open plain was perhaps 1.5 miles, and the whole infantry force had cleared the scrub by 6 o'clock. The sun was setting, and the red glow, brightening the sandy hillocks, made the western horizon indefinite, so that it was hard to tell where the desert ended and the sky began. A few gazelle, intercepted on their way to the water by the unexpected movement of troops, trotted slowly away in the distance, white spots on the rosy brown of the sand, and on the great plain 12,000 infantry, conscious of their strength and eager to encounter the enemy, were beautifully arranged in 4 solid masses. Then the march began. The actual distance from the camp to the dervish position was scarcely 7 miles, but the circle necessary to avoid the bushes and the gradual bends of the river added perhaps another 5 to the length of the road. The pace of the advance was slow, and the troops had not gone far when the sun sank, and with hardly an interval of twilight, darkness enveloped everything. In the stillness of the night the brigades moved steadily forward, and only the regular scrunching of the hard sand betrayed the advance of an overwhelming force upon their enemies. No operation of a war is more critical than a night march. Over and over again, in every country frightful disaster has overtaken the rash or daring force that has attempted it. In the gloom the shape and aspect of the ground are altered. Places well known by daylight appear strange and unrecognizable. The smallest obstacle impedes the column, which can only crawl sluggishly forward with continual checks and halts. The effect of the gloom upon the nerves of the soldiers is not less than on the features of the country. Each man tries to walk quietly, and hence all are listening for the slightest sound. Every eye seeks to pierce the darkness. Every sense in the body is raised to a pitch of expectancy. In such hours doubts and fears come unbidden to the brain, and the marching men wonder anxiously whether all will be well with the army, and whether they themselves will survive the event. And if suddenly out of the black silence there burst the jagged glare of rifles and the crash of a volley followed by the yell of an attacking foe, the steadiest troops may be thrown into confusion, and a panic, once afoot, stops only with the destruction or dispersal of the whole force. Nevertheless, so paramount is the necessity of attacking at dawn, with all the day to finish the fight, that in spite of the recorded disasters and the known dangers, the night march is a frequent operation. For more than 2 hours the force advanced, moving across smooth swells of sand broken by rocks and with occasional small bushes. Several shallow khors traversed the road, and these rocky ditches, filled with a strange, sweet-scented grass, delayed the brigades until the pace was hardly 2 miles an hour. The smell of the grass was noticed by the alert senses of many, and will forever refresh in their minds the strong impression of the night. The breeze which had sprung up at sundown gradually freshened and raised clouds of fine sand, which deepened the darkness with a whiter mist. At 9 o'clock the army halted in a previously selected space, near the deserted village of Mutras and about 2 miles from the river. Nearly half the distance to Mahmud's Zariba was accomplished, and barely 4 miles in the direct line divided the combatants, but since it was not desirable to arrive before the dawn, the soldiers, still formed in their squares, lay down upon the ground. Meat and biscuits were served out to the men. The transport animals went by relays to the pools of the Atbara bed to drink and to replenish the tanks. All water bottles were refilled, pickets being thrown out to cover the business. Then, after sufficient sentries had been posted, the army slept, still in array. During the halt the moon had risen, and when at 1 o'clock the advance was resumed, the white beams revealed a wider prospect, and glinting on the fixed bayonets, crowned the squares with a sinister glitter. For 3 hours the army toiled onwards at the same slow and interrupted crawl. Strict silence was now enforced, and all smoking was forbidden. The cavalry, the camel corps, and the 5 batteries had overtaken the infantry, so that the whole attacking force was concentrated. Meanwhile the dervishes slept. At 3 o'clock the glare of fires became visible to the south, and thus arrived before the dervish position, the squares, with the exception of the reserve brigade, were unlocked, and the whole force, assuming formation of attack, now advanced in one long line through the scattered bush and scrub, presently to emerge upon a large plateau which overlooked Mahmud's Zariba from a distance of about 900 yards. It was still dark, and the haze that shrouded the dervish camp was broken only by the glare of the watchfires. The silence was profound. It seemed impossible to believe that more than 25,000 men were ready to join battle at scarcely the distance of half a mile. Yet the advance had not been unperceived, and the Arabs knew that their terrible antagonists crouched on the ridge waiting for the morning. For a while the suspense was prolonged. At last, after what seemed to many an interminable period, the uniform blackness of the horizon was broken by the first glimmer of the dawn. Gradually the light grew stronger until, as a theatre curtain is pulled up, the darkness rolled away, the vague outlines in the haze became definite, and the whole scene was revealed. The British and Egyptian army lay along the low ridge in the form of a great bow, the British brigade on the left, MacDonald in the center, Maxwell curving forward on the right. The whole crest of the swell of ground was crowned with a bristle of bayonets, and the tiny figures of thousands of men sitting, or lying down, and gazing curiously before them. Behind them, in a solid square, was the transport, guarded by Lewis's brigade. The leading squadrons of the cavalry were forming leisurely towards the left flank. The 4 batteries and a rocket detachment, moving between the infantry, ranged themselves on 2 convenient positions about 100 yards in front of the line of battalions. All was ready. Yet everything was very quiet, and in the stillness of the dawn it almost seemed that nature held her breath. Half a mile away, at the foot of the ridge, a long irregular black line of thorn bushes enclosed the dervish defenses. Behind this zareba low palisades and entrenchments bent back to the scrub by the river. Odd shapeless mounds indicated the positions of the gun emplacements, and various casemates could be seen in the middle of the enclosure. Without, the bushes had been cleared away, and the smooth sand stretched in a gentle slope to where the army waited. Within were crowds of little straw huts and scattered bushes, growing thicker to the southward. From among this rose the palm trees, between whose stems the dry bed of the Atbara was exposed, and a single pool of water gleamed in the early sunlight. Such was Mahmud's famous zareba, which for more than a month had been the predominant thought in the minds of the troops. It was scarcely imposing, and at first the soldiers thought it deserted. Only a dozen stray horsemen sat silently on their horses outside the entrenchment, watching their enemies, and inside a few dirty white figures appeared and disappeared behind the parapets. Yet, insignificant as the zareba looked, the smoke of many fires cooking the morning meal, never to be eaten, showed that it was occupied by men, and gay banners of varied color and device, flaunting along the entrenchments, or within the enclosure, declared that some at least were prepared to die in its defense. The hush of the hour and the suspense of the army were broken by the bang of a gun. Everyone on the ridge jumped up and looked towards the sound. A battery of Krupps a little to the right of the Cameron Highlanders had opened fire. Another gun further to the right was fired. Another shell burst over the straw huts among the palm trees. The 2 Maxim Nordenfeldt batteries had come into action. The officers looked at their watches. It was 6:15. The bombardment had begun. Explosion followed explosion in quick succession, until all 4 batteries were busily engaged. The cannonade grew loud and continuous. The rocket detachment began to fire, and the strange projectiles hissed and screamed as they left the troughs and jerked erratically towards the zareba. In the air above the enclosure shell after shell flashed into existence, smote the ground with its leaden shower, and dispersed, a mere film, into the haze and smoke which still hung over the dervish encampment. At the very first shot all the dirty white figures disappeared, bobbing down into their pits and shelters, but a few solitary horsemen remained motionless for a while in the middle of the enclosure, watching the effect of the fire, as if it had no concern with them. The British infantry stood up on tiptoe to look at the wonderful spectacle of actual war, and at first every shell was eagerly scrutinized and its probable effect discussed. But the busy gunners multiplied the projectiles, until so many were alive in the air at once that all criticism was prevented. Gradually even the strange sight became monotonous. The officers shut up their glasses, The men began to sit down again. Many of them actually went to sleep. The rest were soon tired of the amazing scene, the like of which they had never looked on before, and awaited impatiently further developments, and some new thing. After the bombardment had lasted about 10 minutes, a great cloud of dust sprang up in the zareba, and hundreds of horsemen were seen scrambling into their saddles and galloping through a gap in the rear face out into the open sand to the right. To meet the possibility of an attempt to turn the left flank of the attack, the 8 squadrons of cavalry and 2 Maxim guns jingled and clattered off in the direction of the danger. The dust, which the swift passage of so many horsemen raised, shut the scene from the eyes of the infantry, but continual dust clouds above the scrub to the left and the noise of the Maxims seemed to indicate a cavalry fight. The Baggara horse, however, declined an unequal combat, and made no serious attempt to interfere with the attack. Twice they showed some sort of front, and the squadrons thought they might find opportunity to charge, but a few rounds from the Maxims effectually checked the enemy, inflicting on each occasion the loss of about 20 killed and wounded. With the exception of 1 squadron detached on the right, the Egyptian cavalry force, however, remained on the left flank, and shielded the operations of the assaulting infantry. Meanwhile the bombardment, no longer watched with curiosity, continued with accuracy and precision. The batteries searched the interior of the zareba, threshing out one section after another, and working the whole ground regularly from front to rear. The zareba and palisades were knocked about in many places, and at 6:45 a cluster of straw huts caught fire and began to burn briskly. At 7:15 the infantry were ordered to form in column for assault. The plan of the attack for the army was simple. The long, deployed line were to advance steadily against the entrenchments, subduing by their continual fire that of the enemy. They were then to tear the zareba to pieces. Covered by their musketry, the dense columns of assault which had followed the line were to enter the defenses through the gaps, deploy to the right, and march through the enclosure, clearing it with the bayonet and by fire. At 20 minutes to 8 the Sirdar ordered his bugles to sound the general advance. The call was repeated by all the brigades, and the clear notes rang out above the noise of the artillery. The superior officers, with the exception of Hunter, Maxwell, and MacDonald, dismounted and placed themselves at the head of their commands. The whole mass of the infantry, numbering nearly 11,000 men, immediately began to move forward upon the zareba. The scene as this great force crested the ridge and advanced down the slope was magnificent and tremendous. Large solid columns of men, preceded by a long double line, with the sunlight flashing on their bayonets and displaying their ensigns, marched to the assault in regular and precise array. The pipes of the Highlanders, the bands of the Sudanese, and the drums and fifes of the English regiments added a wild and thrilling accompaniment. As soon as the advance masked the batteries, the guns were run forward with the firing line, in order effectually to support the attack. The deployed battalions opened a ceaseless and crushing fire on the entrenchment, and as the necessity of firing delayed the advance of the attacking columns, the pace did not exceed a slow march. The dervishes remained silent until the troops were within 300 yards. Then the smoke puffs spurted out all along the stockades, and a sharp fusillade began, gradually and continually growing in intensity, until the assaulting troops were exposed to a furious and effective fire. From 250 yards up to the position losses began to occur. The whole entrenchment was rimmed with flame and smoke, amid which the active figures of the dervish riflemen were momentarily visible, and behind the filmy curtain solid masses of swordsmen and spearmen appeared. The fortunate interposition of a small knoll in some degree protected the advance of the Lincoln Regiment, but in both Highland battalions soldiers began to drop. The whole air was full of a strange chirping whistle. The hard pebbly sand was everywhere dashed up into dust spurts. Numerous explosive bullets, fired by the Arabs, made queer startling reports. The roar of the rifles drowned even the noise of the artillery. All the deployed battalions began to suffer. But they and the assaulting columns, regardless of the fire, bore down on the zareba in all the majesty of war, an avalanche of men, stern, unflinching, utterly irresistible. 200 yards from the entrenchment, and 150 from the thorn bushes, independent firing broke out, running along the line from end to end. Shooting continually, but without any hurry or confusion, the British and Sudanese battalions continued their slow, remorseless advance, and it was evident that, in spite of the fierce fire of the defense, which was now causing many casualties, the assault would be successful. The loss during the passage of the zareba, and in the assault of the entrenchments, was severe. Captain Findlay and Major Urquhart, of the Cameron Highlanders, were both mortally wounded in the fight at the stockades, and expired still cheering on their men. Major Napier, of the same regiment, and Captain Bailey, of the Seaforth Highlanders, received the wounds, of which they subsequently died, a few yards further on. At all points the troops broke into the enclosure. Behind the stockade there ran a treble trench. The whole interior was honeycombed with pits and holes. From these there now sprang thousands of dervishes, desperately endeavoring to show a front to the attack. Second Lieutenant Gore, a young officer fresh from Sandburst, was shot dead between the thorn fence and the stockade. Other officers in the Lincoln and the Warwickshire regiments sustained severe wounds. Many soldiers were killed and wounded in the narrow space. These losses were general throughout the assaulting brigades. In the 5 minutes, which were occupied in the passage of the obstruction, about 400 casualties occurred. The attack continued. The British brigade had struck the extremity of the north front of the zareba, and thus took the whole of the eastern face in enfilade, sweeping it with their terrible musketry from end to end and strewing the ground with corpses. Although, owing to the lines of advance having converged, there was not room for more than half the force to deploy, the brigades pushed on. The conduct of the attack passed to the company commanders. All these officers kept their heads, and brought their companies up into the general line as the front gradually widened and gaps appeared. So the whole force, companies, battalions, even brigades, mixed up together and formed in one dense, ragged, but triumphant line, marched on unchecked towards the river bed, driving their enemies in hopeless confusion before them. Yet, although the dervishes were unable to make head against the attack, they disdained to run. Many hundreds held their ground, firing their rifles valiantly till the end. Others charged with spear and sword. The greater part retired in skirmishing order, jumping over the numerous pits, walking across the open spaces, and repeatedly turning round to shoot. The ex-South Sudanese encountered the most severe resistance after the defences were penetrated. As their 3 deployed companies pressed on through the enclosure, they were confronted by a small inner zareba stubbornly defended by the Emir Mahmud's personal bodyguard. These poured a sudden volley into the center company at close range, and so deadly was the effect that nearly all the company were shot, falling to the ground still in their ranks, so that a British officer passing at a little distance was provoked to inquire what they were doing lying down. Notwithstanding this severe check, the regiment, gallantly led by their colonel and supported by the ex-Th Sudanese, rushed this last defense, and slew its last defenders. Mahmud was himself captured. Having duly inspected his defenses and made his dispositions, he had sheltered in a specially constructed casemate. Thence he was now ignominiously dragged, and on his being recognized, the intervention of a British officer alone saved him from the fury of the excited Sudanese. Still the advance continued, and it seemed to those who took part in it more like a horrible nightmare than a waking reality. Captains and subalterns collected whatever men they could, heedless of corps or nationality, and strove to control and direct their fire. Gibber-clad figures sprang out of the ground, fired or charged, and were destroyed at every step. And onwards over their bodies, over pits choked with dead and dying, among heaps of mangled camels and donkeys, among decapitated or eviscerated trunks, the ghastly results of the shell fire, women and little children killed by the bombardment or praying in wild terror for mercy, blacks chained in their trenches, slaughtered in their chains, always onwards marched the conquerors, with bayonets running blood, clothes, hands and faces all besmeared, the foul stench of a month's accumulated filth in their nostrils, and the savage whistle of random bullets in their ears. But at about 20 minutes past 8 the whole force, with the Seaforth Highlanders well forward on the left, arrived at the bank of the Atbara, having marched completely through the position, and shot or bayoneted all in their path. Hundreds of dervishes were still visible retiring across the dry bed of the river, and making for the scrub on the opposite bank. The leading companies of the Seaforth Highlanders and Lincolns, with such odd parties of Camerons as had been carried on with the attack, opened a murderous fire on these fugitives. Since they would not run, their loss was heavy, and it was a strange sight, the last vivid impression of the day, to watch them struggling through the deep sand, with the dust knocked up into clouds by the bullets which struck all round them. Very few escaped, and the bodies of the killed lay thickly dotting the riverbed with heaps of dirty white. Then at 8:25 the ceasefire sounded, and the Battle of the Atbara ended. Forthwith the battalions began to reform, and in every company the roll was called. The losses had been severe. In the assault, a period not exceeding half an hour, 18 British, 16 native officers, and 525 men had been killed or wounded, the greater part during the passage of the Zareba. The actual pursuit was abortive. Colonel Lewis, with his 2 battalions, followed a line of advance which led south of the Zareba, and just before reaching the river bank found and fired upon a few dervishes retreating through the scrub. All the cavalry and the camel corps crossed the Atbara, and plunged into the bush on the further side. But so dense and tangled was the country that after 3 miles of peril and perplexity they abandoned the attempt, and the routed Arabs fled unmolested. The Baggara horse had ridden off during the action, headed by the prudent Osman Digna, whose position in the Zareba was conveniently suited to such a maneuver, and under that careful leadership suffered little loss. The rest of the army was, however, destroyed or dispersed. The fugitives fled up the Atbara River, leaving many wounded to die in the scrub, all along their line of retreat. Of the powerful force of 12,000 fighting men, which Mahmud had gathered at Metemmeh, scarcely 4,000 reached Gadaret in safety. These survivors were added to the army of Ahmed Fedil, and thus prevented from spreading their evil tidings among the populace at Omdurman. Osman Digna, Wad Bishara, and other important emirs whose devotion and discretion were undoubted, alone returned to the capital. As soon as the troops were reformed, the Zareba was evacuated and the army drew up in line along the neighboring ridge. It was then only 9 o'clock, and the air was still cool and fresh. The soldiers lit fires, made some tea, and ate their rations of biscuits and meat. Then they lay down and waited for evening. Gradually, as the hours passed, the sun became powerful. There was no shade, and only a few thin, leafless bushes rose from the sand. The hours of a day, peculiarly hot, even for the country and season, dragged wearily away. The sandy ridge beat back the rays till the air above was like the breath of a furnace and the pebbly ground burned. The water in the fantasses and bottles was hot and scarce. The pool of the Atbara was foul and tainted. In spite of the devoted efforts of the few medical officers who had been allowed to accompany the force, the wounded officers and soldiers endured the greatest miseries, and it is certain that several died of their wounds who might in happier circumstances have been saved. Several hundred prisoners were taken. They were mostly Negroes, for the Arabs refused to surrender, and fought to the last or tried to escape. The captive blacks, who fight with equal willingness on either side, were content to be enlisted in the Sudanese regiments, so that many of those who served the Khalifa on the Atbara helped to destroy him at Omdurman. The most notable prisoner was the Emir Mahmud, the tall, strong Arab, about 30 years old. Immediately after his capture, he was dragged before the Sirdar. "Why," inquired the general, "have you come into my country to burn and kill?" "I have to obey my orders, and so have you," retorted the captive sullenly, yet not without a certain dignity. To other questions he returned curt or evasive answers, and volunteered the opinion that all the slaughter would be avenged at Omdurman. He was removed in custody, a fine specimen of proud brutality, worthy perhaps of some better fate than to linger indefinitely in the gale at Rosetta. With the cool of the evening the army left its bed of torment on the ridge, and returned to Umdabia. The homeward march was a severe trial, the troops were exhausted, the ground was broken, the guides, less careful, or less fortunate than on the previous night, lost their way. The columns were encumbered with wounded, most of whom were already in a high state of fever, and whose sufferings were painful to witness. It was not until after midnight that the camp was reached. The infantry had been continuously under arms, marching, fighting, or sweltering in the sun, for 30 hours, and most of them had hardly closed their eyes for 2 days. Force, the wounded officers and soldiers endured the greatest miseries, and it is certain that several died of their wounds who might in happier circumstances have been saved. Several hundred prisoners were taken. They were mostly Negroes, for the Arabs refused to surrender, and fought to the last or tried to escape. The captive blacks, who fight with equal willingness on either side, were content to be enlisted in the Sudanese regiments, so that many of those who served the Khalifa on the Atbara helped to destroy him at Omdurman. The most notable prisoner was the Emir Mahmud, the tall, strong Arab, about 30 years old. Immediately after his capture, he was dragged before the Sirdar. "Why," inquired the general, "have you come into my country to burn and kill?" "I have to obey my orders, and so have you," retorted the captive sullenly, yet not without a certain dignity. To other questions he returned curt or evasive answers, and volunteered the opinion that all the slaughter would be avenged at Omdurman. He was removed in custody, a fine specimen of proud brutality, worthy perhaps of some better fate than to linger indefinitely in the gale at Rosetta. With the cool of the evening the army left its bed of torment on the ridge, and returned to Umdabia. The homeward march was a severe trial, the troops were exhausted, the ground was broken, the guides, less careful, or less fortunate than on the previous night, lost their way. The columns were encumbered with wounded, most of whom were already in a high state of fever, and whose sufferings were painful to witness. It was not until after midnight that the camp was reached. The infantry had been continuously under arms, marching, fighting, or sweltering in the sun, for 30 hours, and most of them had hardly closed their eyes for 2 days. Officers and soldiers, British, Sudanese, and Egyptian, struggled into their bivouacs, and fell asleep, very weary but victorious. British and Egyptian casualties on the Atbara included 20 officers, and 539 men killed or wounded. The dervish loss was officially estimated at 40 emirs and 3,000 dervishes killed. No statistics as to their wounded are forthcoming. As the Battle of the Atbara had been decisive, the whole expeditionary force went into summer quarters. The Egyptian army was distributed into 3 principal garrisons, 4 battalions at Atbara camp, 6 battalions and the cavalry at Berber, 3 battalions at Abadia. The artillery and transport were proportionately divided. The British brigade encamped with 2 battalions at Darmali and 2 at the village of Salim, about 1.5 miles distant. For the final phase of the campaign 3 new gunboats had been ordered from England. These were now sent in sections over the desert railway. Special arrangements were made to admit of the clumsy loads passing trains on the ordinary sidings. As usual, the contrivances of the railway subalterns were attended with success. Sir H. Kitchener himself proceeded to Abadia to accelerate, by his personal activity and ingenuity, the construction of the vessels on which so much depended. Here during the heat of the summer he remained, nursing his gunboats, maturing his plans, and waiting only for the rise of the river to complete the downfall of his foes.